Our mission is this. We are a community of spiritual seekers inspired to promote a just and compassionate world. Today we welcome back to the pulpit Reverend Ayliah Cannon.
You may be wondering why there is a fire bowl in the middle of our sanctuary. And it's all about that word, imagine. Have any of you ever belonged to the Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts or... Oh, right, we've got a few. I belong to the Explorers. And that was like a co-ed group that was part of the Boy Scouts. And we used to go on these camping trips in the middle of the woods. And we'd all sit around the campfire and we'd just build connections with each other. And it was such a wonderful experience. Some of you may not know who I am, so let me just introduce myself real quick. My name is Ayliah. I am a fully ordained reverend. However, I am not a UU fellowshipped minister. So I want to offer that disclaimer. I want to ask you something today, though. I want to ask you to consider, why do we covenant? Why do we covenant? And more importantly, can you covenant with me today? And I'll tell you why. Because tomorrow is Memorial Day. And for a lot of us, we're remembering someone who went off to war and didn't come back. And that's a pretty heavy topic. When we covenant with each other, it doesn't mean that that one of us is right and one of us is wrong. It means that we agree to listen to each other. And Memorial Day should be taken seriously because we've lost a lot of people over the years to different wars. My dad was a veteran in the Korean War in the 1950s. Yes, I was adopted. Don't try to guess my age. And I can remember how proud he was to be a part of that history. I had 3 uncles that served. Boy, was there a lot of pressure on me to join the military. My dad had this friend who was a retired admiral, and before I graduated, he took me to see this retired admiral, and this guy says, if you want to get into the Naval Academy, you got it. I didn't want to go to the Naval Academy. That kind of broke my dad's heart, but I did go in the military. I served in the Navy for almost 4 full years, and I'm very proud of the work I did while I was in. But Memorial Day is something different. It's been around since 1968, I believe. It started after the Civil War, and we lost like over 600,000 people in the Civil War. And I just think that we need to talk about things one-on-one. That's why I'm starting off down here. And Fellowship of Newark, this is your call to worship.
We breathe in the common wind of the earth, no matter where we live, who we love, and whatever language is spoken. We drink the common water of the earth, no matter the color of our skin and the coverings we drape over our forms. We follow the common path of earth, no matter our beliefs, no matter how far we stray from home. We learn from these truths, and our hearts open to the goodness that surrounds us. Our minds are always open to discovering the common good.
You know, I mentioned earlier that I wasn't prepared or excited about Officer Training Academy or the Naval Academy. And part of that was we had a neighbor who came back from the Vietnam War with Agent Orange. My father was an advocate for him, and along with many other veterans who were not very healthy. They had missing limbs, they had depression, they had all kinds of illness, and he helped them to get their veterans benefits squared away. And I met so many kids that never saw their dads or their uncles again, and that scared me. I wasn't ready to make that ultimate sacrifice. Even though I did go in, I was worried. I grew up in the aftermath of the Vietnam War, and all I can say is there are people out there much braver than I am, and I thank them every year on this day. 77 years ago, our founding fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. And that famous speech goes on to say that from these honored dead, we take increased devotion to that cause which they gave their last breath, that this nation shall have a new birth of freedom. Now, obviously, I have paraphrased part of this, but I'm sure you recognize the Gettysburg Address from 1863. 1 year prior to that, Abraham Lincoln met Ralph Waldo Emerson when he invited him to speak at the Mall in Washington, D.C. in 1862. Lincoln was deeply inspired by the Transcendentalist movement. He was inspired when he wrote the words, "All men are created equal." He got that straight out of the movement. Both he and Walt Whitman had already written extensively that a union of states could only exist in the hearts and minds unless there was a living example to go by. Both men agreed that a piece of paper with a presidential seal would provide no compulsion for people to pursue equality. Whereas Thoreau was always quick to respond and tell people to question their consciousness, Emerson was more deliberate and more slow. He wanted to reflect on what he was seeing around him, and he wanted to take in the beauty of the moment before he chose a path of rightness and moral action. When he contemplated the beauty around him, he also took in the fact that there were a lot of both good and bad things going on. And he said that the connection between these good and bad things and the wonder of it all. That even though we are witness to a history of atrocities, these atrocities serve to teach us the lessons to pursue a life of moral action and justice. That if we take the time to see and be aware of the beauty in all ordinary things, that we can enrich our experience of life more fully. Memorial Day may be a day of lessons, but it is also a time that we can acknowledge the strides which have been made forth by this country to achieve the rights that we do have. An example of contemporary relevance to this beauty in something good and bad is the example of a road construction which we have going on right down the road here. Now you see all this construction. This is totally disrupting the landscape. But in the future, it will assist communities to connect better with each other. Although frankly, I doubt Emerson saw the beauty in a superhighway being built. I'm not sure he would agree with that much nature being sacrificed. But beauty is often not perfect in composition. There are flaws, cracks, and scars. Emerson said that we are not only connected to the beauty, but to the scars, and thus to the wonder of it all. And what is nature is beauty, and what is scarred can also be beautiful. I choose to see the beauty of our country. I imagine what this country could be with justice, freedom, and equality. Benjamin Franklin is quoted as saying, "Where liberty dwells, there is my country." I went into the military 1 month after high school, and I regretted it, as I mentioned. I saw my friends going off to college. They were having fun. They were talking about all these new things they were doing. But my family was rather poor. I grew up on Social Security. And my high school didn't tell me that there were grants available. I didn't know I could apply for a student loan. So for me, the military was my only way out of this little rural town of only about 3,000 people. But before I graduated that year, I went to the last Memorial Day service with my dad. He had been asked to speak to the crowds about his experiences and what Memorial Day meant to him. So in some ways today, I feel like I am honoring the memory of my father by standing up here. I was so proud of him. I watched him walk in with the honor guard next to the flags. And when he took that podium, I mean, there were tears in his eyes, and there was so much feeling in his words. And I don't remember a single word he said. All I remember is the passion with which he embraced the audience. It was like a kid who just hit a home run for the first time, and he's rounding the bases, and he's all excited, and he gets home, and it's like, you know, that was my dad speaking to those guests. I was so proud of him. Memorial Day has a way of deepening feelings of patriotism. Unfortunately, it also deepens feelings of nationalism. And there is a downside to nationalism. Most of us witnessed the events of 9/11 in some way. I remember how I did it. I was on a job interview, and there was a woman interviewing me, and someone came in and interrupted us, and she said, quick, you got to come into the break room. And we went in, and I stood there with 20 complete strangers I'd never met before, glued to the television, just in stunned silence. The next day, week, month, even years afterwards, we are still dealing with some fallout from that expansive news coverage, seeing that on the news all day long, every day, for many days. Nationalism can be described as pride in one's country, but if it is not tempered with compassion and awareness, it can easily lead to negative feelings about other countries. After 9/11, Muslims were vilified by the media. Remember, they were in every show. Every show had a story about Muslims. It was all over. And watching the news media, I couldn't help but thinking that at my previous job, there was this guy. His name was Sam. Quiet, unassuming, very gentle. He'd give me rides to work when my car broke down. He'd sit with me at lunch when nobody was around for me to sit with. And he was an African Muslim. I couldn't imagine him ever bombing a building. It was just too sweet. The media is a powerful agent for decreasing empathy. Both NIH and Psychology Today have published studies about how viewing violent content raises anxiety and increases the likelihood of aggressive behavior by lowering one's ability to deal with stress. Both resources compared this reaction to the PTSD symptom of fight or flight. Now, perhaps you remember the attempts to label video games as creating the same kind of response, the same violence in teenagers. But the problem with that attempt is that most gamers realize it's just a game. It's not real. Most. Everyone's different. Not like the reality of what is happening in the Gaza Strip, which has triggered anger and anti-Semitic creedism. Now, at one time in this area comprising Israel, Palestine, Gaza, portions of Libya, Syria, and Jordan, this was all Canaan. And if you're familiar with the Bible, this was the promised lands that were offered to Abraham and his descendants, the Jewish people. Now, at one time, it was ruled by the Ottoman Empire, and the British drove them out. And they established some order, which was good. Unfortunately, the order also shadowed the existence of several Zionist leaders. And Zionism can be taken a couple of different ways. For some, it's establishing a Jewish homeland. Fantastic. But for others, it looked like ethnic cleansing. And over the ensuing decades, chaos in Gaza took hold as control switched back and forth between Palestine, Israel, Egypt, until the Hamas took over in 2005. The Gaza war is what happens when nationalism is out of control. Each side seeing themselves as being right, with no room for cooperation and understanding. Imagine if they could covenant, like I spoke to you about earlier. I think more people should be UUs. Could learn so much from us, but maybe I'm biased. Nationalism is not the same as patriotism, though. I want to make sure that we understand the difference. By definition, nationalists see their nation as infallible, sitting above all others, like in a hierarchy. But patriots see their country as flawed, and they can still love it because patriotism forms an emotional connection. These terms are not interchangeable, despite how many times we may see them used interchangeably in the media and by people who don't know the definitions. There is a fine line which separates nationalism and patriotism. There are also varying degrees in patriotism. I mean, think about it. Love for a country, love can be very obsessive for some people. Our Unitarian Universalist principle number 6 encourages us to embrace peace, liberty, and justice for all. But there are other principles that we could apply to developing love for our country. Perhaps equity in human relations. Being patriotic could mean supporting the best quality of life for all of a country's citizens. The Gettysburg Address encourages us to believe all men are created equal. Our Constitution encourages us to believe that we should promote the general welfare. Now, what does the general welfare look like to some of you out there? Do you have a picture of it in your mind? The general welfare could look like maintaining roads, building new hospitals, schools, feeding the poor. For many leaders, promoting the general welfare also means having a strong military to protect them. And economists going back 2 centuries, all the way back to the War of 1812, came up with this theory that the way a country spends money can fall into two different categories. And this was called the guns and butter argument. Now, if a country is spending money on its guns, that's a little bit more obvious. Soldiers, ships, aircraft, subs, even military support personnel. And if a country is spending money on butter, then that is almost anything else. It's butter, it's food, it's housing, it's improving the hospitals and the schools, maintaining the infrastructure. But we know spending itself is rarely equitable, and that's why taxation and borrowing happens. So the next time you hear a politician say, they're cutting back on taxes, ask them which side of the guns and butter argument are they cutting back on? Back around 1953, President Eisenhower said the following: every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who are hungry, who go unfed, and those who are cold go unclothed. The most expensive bomber costs $177 million. And 177, I can't even imagine $1 million, 177. HUD estimates that there are roughly 653,000 homeless people, and that it would take 46,000 to put one in a house. That means for the cost of one bomber, we could house over 3,000 people. I read where there's only like 1,200 people considered homeless in Delaware. Could wipe out so much of this issue. We are in the heat of a political season. Where do you want to see your money spent? I wonder if Ralph Waldo Emerson, in his attempts to see the beauty in all things, could he find the beauty in a bomber jet or an atom bomb? Perhaps beauty is more subjective. Perhaps a life sacrificed for the freedoms of others is not equal in value to one of the constitutional freedoms which we are still waiting for, such as racial equality. Been working on that one a long time. Perhaps, as UUs, we are not done with our individual searches for truth and meaning. Perhaps our search for truth is not a destination, but a journey full of complicated discussions which require covenanting, unanswerable questions which we may ponder for some time, and constant detours like a treasure hunt which for artifacts which only we can possibly understand the beauty and the sacred value of. So let us consider the sacrifice that many of these men have made. I have heard many times, was their sacrifice in vain? No. No, it wasn't in vain if we consider we did make progress. But if we can't see that progress, then we're missing out on a whole lot of beauty and courage and pride that this country is built on.
And now we extinguish our chalice. Please join us in reading aloud the chalice extinguishing. The words are in your order of service and on screen. We extinguish the flame of our chalice, but not the light of understanding, the warmth of its community, or the fire of its commitment. Behold your hearts, which are ruled today. And now for our closing words, Reverend Cannon.
Some heavy stuff. But if we put it back into the context of sitting around a campfire, nice cool breeze blowing around us, we're just a community of friends, sharing feelings, sharing memories, sharing thoughts. Maybe we're on the right track, maybe we aren't. But as long as we believe in peace and doing what's right, I don't think we can go wrong. May our quest for beauty never be dampened by the apparent lack of it in the political climate of this world. And may we always find value in the significant sacrifice which our forebears made to protect our country. The amount of that value will depend on how much you value the rights that you do have. The value of their sacrifice will also depend on how much we choose to act to promote the general welfare of all, regardless of race, ethnicity, religion, economic class, gender, political party, and the list goes on. We must believe that people are created equal before we can believe we can treat them as equal. Thank you.